microaggressions are often unconscious. They don't have to be. Interactions around race, class, and gender, they can come in three different forms. They can come in the form of insult, invalidation, or an assault. So assault is the most explicit, and that's a little more what we might consider as sort of this individual kind of racist act. And invalidation is usually very unconscious and much less explicit. So as a student was sharing their experience, I might ignore that experience and just turn away from them and ask another student a question. I might say, actually, that's not true, right? Or I might downplay whatever their sort of comment is. So that'd be a micro invalidation. And then micro insult could actually come sometimes in the form of something that sounds really positive, like, wow, you're so much better at math than African Americans, which sounds like a individual compliment, but is really an insult to the whole people, right? So microaggressions can come in different forms. They're often very subtle. They happen on average about once a day to people of color, and they happen pretty frequently in math classrooms. They're much more kind of unconscious interactions around that implicitly reference race rather than usually explicitly. So I don't say, you're bad at math because you're black. That would be way too explicit for how we talk about race these days. But I might say, yeah, you're one of my low learners, aren't you? Right? And underlying that might have some implicit ideas that there's reasons that you're a low learner because you're African American. So the really sort of complex piece is parsing out, when we don't actually talk about race, that some of this actually might be racial. And that's actually the sort of most interesting piece, but it's also the most complex piece to make a case about. I think there were a couple factors that happened. One was spending more time in urban schools, doing research, but also working with teachers. We started to transform the sort of teaching of mathematics, but some students were still left out. So even when you get what we call sort of more reformed teaching of mathematics that focus on mathematical concepts and student explanations and justification, there's still some students that can be left out of it. You can still have teachers who actually treat students harshly, that critique them harshly, that reprimand behavior or kick students out of the class or give referrals. So part of it, I think, is about teaching better, but I think there's this other layer that I started to see in schools that maps the broader society as well. It's just that schools are sort of a microcosm in a sort of more intense interaction when you have someone who's teaching kids who aren't their own, and sometimes different racially or ethnically even their students. Even when sometimes those align, being from a different social class can some teachers can interpret student behavior differently. So it's not just sort of ethnic and racial differences that are playing out in the classroom. Sometimes it's different cultural norms. We have ways of sort of characterizing teachers and students very statically, culturally, when sometimes if you have a teacher who is a middle-class African-American teacher and you have poor African-American students, there can sometimes be a clash there as well. But seeing in the other piece of it is about 88% of our workforce is white. So even while you do have some of these conflicts, the biggest conflict is usually racial when you're in urban schools that are predominantly African American or Latino. So the more I actually spent in classrooms, I realized there were some other things going on as well. So we can change the math instruction, but if teachers are still bringing what we might call implicit racial attitudes to bear, which instead of being explicitly sort of what we think of as racist, people can internalize stereotypes, can internalize sort of messages from the media and from society, and that leads them to interact in particular ways with students that align with those stereotypes because of racial or class or gender notions. So as I started to see that more, I was interested not only in this layer of sort of teaching math, but microaggressions or relational interactions about how teachers and students are relating. and understanding more about how that is impacting student learning and the teaching of mathematics as well. I was really spending time in classrooms actually working on the math instruction and then seeing some things happen that still weren't aligned with what we'd want to see about how teachers and students interact.